A no-sleep story posted by drewtheunquestioned. The worst inmate at my prison is loose and I don't think he's human. I'm writing this while the prison I work at is in lockdown. One of our inmates has disappeared from his cell and we're searching the whole facility for him. Honestly, I hope we don't find him. I don't care if he got out, just so long as he isn't here anymore. I can't think of anyone who scared me as much as that guy did. He'd only been here a few months, yet everyone in this place is either terrified of him or wants him dead, and that includes us guards. I had been working for the Lakeland Correctional Facility for almost 2 years before they brought him in. We had a few infamous prisoners and more than a few I had to watch my back around, but overall it was pretty standard. We watch each other's backs and keep our head on a swivel around the animals. In those 2 years I only had a half-dozen incidents I was involved with, most of which were nothing more than domestic disputes and a few drug busts. Couple of times I had to put some mouthy con in his place, but when this guy came in from the city, he changed the place somehow. Guy had no name, no ID of any kind. A pure John Doe case, which is something that never happens anymore. He was doing life for killing a family in their home for seemingly no reason. Like these animals need a reason, but he wasn't on drugs, didn't have a weapon, didn't even speak English or any kind of language. It was like he dropped out of the sky from another world. He'd killed the family with his bare hands and teeth, looked like a rabid dog attack. Cops found him in a closet covered in blood and looking like a cornered animal. It took 4 deputies to bring him in. Obviously, no one here had any idea who he was or what to expect. There was talk about him, theories about who he was, where he came from, but it was all just casual banter, until he actually arrived. Even before you saw him, you felt something. Like a shadow when a cloud blocks the sun, a drop in temperature and a kind of heaviness that made you feel anxious for no real reason. Everybody felt it, even the other inmates. They briefed all the guards on him and gave us what little information they had on him. He wasn't even officially sentenced to serve his time at this prison. He was here temporarily for the foreseeable future until they could get him to talk or find out where the hell he came from. The warden decided to keep him in the psych ward until they could figure out how he would be around other inmates. I'll never forget the day he arrived. It was unbearably hot and muggy. The overcast sky made everything look grey and washed out. The bus he came in on stopped by the yard where all the inmates gathered to assess the new meat. The bus driver hurried off and quickly threw up around the front of the bus. He was white as a sheet and visibly shaking. I wasn't assigned to unload the new prisoners that day, but I watched as they were brought out one by one on a long chain. Normally when new prisoners arrive, the yard is like a school cafeteria, all chattering, laughing and shouting about the new guys. But that day it was quiet as a funeral. They all just watched with identical looks of unease. Even the few that joked around or tried to break the tension seemed only half-hearted. The prisoners at the front walked steady, looking over their shoulder nervously, their faces pale and sweaty. Right away you could tell where he was in the line because the guys in front of him moved quickly to get away and the guys behind him hung back. They kept him away just as far as the chain would allow, and seeing him, even from a distance, I could understand why. Now I've seen some pretty gnarly dudes come through here. Guys who were homeless when they got. They were hairy and smelly and left a brown stain on everything they so much as looked at. But this guy, he was something else. He was tall and thin, had to be 7 feet easy. He was so filthy and greasy I couldn't tell if he was black or white or what. Looked like his skin was just wet clay stuck on a skeleton, and if you touched him you'd leave finger-shaped holes in it and come away with crud stuck under your nails that would never wash off. His hair was long and stringy and hung over his face. It looked like the hair you'd pull out of a shower drain, wet with grease and God knows what. His face was like a skull dipped in black muck. He had lips, but they were so thin they never really closed. His teeth were the color of corn kernels sticking out of a green turd. If it weren't for his eyes I would have thought he was a corpse made into a puppet as a joke. His eyes were sunken but wide, looked like an infected boil with pupils black as corpse beetles. I've seen crazy before. I've seen guys who looked ready to bark and chew a guy's face off at any moment. This guy was impossible to read. Sometimes he seemed like a cringing coward who'd piss himself if you moved at him. Other times he'd be vicious as an alpha mandrill. The worst thing about him was the smell though. God, you can't get away from it. As soon as it hits you, it stays with you for days like it's got a handful of your nose hairs and just hangs there for dear life. It was like a dead dog floating in a barrel of medical waste. You almost expected to see maggots squirming around in his hair. All that was bad enough. But what really got to me was how terrifying he was. Not because of anything he said or did. Just looking at him or even being in the same room as him made you want to either turn tail and run or rush him head on and choke the life out of him. He had that effect on everyone. Buddies of mine that would stare down a stone-cold killer. They wouldn't go near him, and if we made them they promised to put him down like a rabid dog. Just seeing him look at you made you want to scream. I'd never met anyone who made people on edge by just existing like that. He was wrong. Everything about him was wrong. We all hated him, and even though we kept him separate from the inmates, they hated him too. That first night we put him in psych ward. We had to clear out all the other inmates because they looked ready to chew through the bars if we didn't get them away from him. Even the guards didn't want to go near him to check on him. They said he was screaming and banging around all night in there. After that we moved him into the protected custody wing with all the snitches and pedos. Let those scum deal with him. It wasn't long before we noticed the effect he was having on the inmates. They all looked worse than ever, mean-tempered, jumpy, ready snap at anyone over anything. I'd never seen them like that. If things kept on that way we were gonna have a damn riot on our hands. I could tell the warden saw it too. He said the attorney that worked on his case had nothing else for us on him. Warden said he even suggested we just put him down and call it an accident. It's not like the guy had a family or anyone to care enough to sue or investigate. I think Warden was giving that idea serious thought until the rumors started. At first it was the pedos claiming they'd seen him in their cell after lights out, or that he'd been showing up in their dreams. I was ready to believe it was just because the guy was weird looking and smelled so bad it would drive anyone crazy. But the other COs who worked that block at night said they thought they saw him outside his cell. A couple of times they almost raised the alarm when they saw a shape duck into an empty room. But when they went in and turned on the light no one was there and the freak was still in his cell. They told me they never saw him on his bunk. He was always just standing at the back of the cell and watching them as they passed, standing there looking like NoSleep if he had a serious drug problem and slept in a septic tank. What was strange was, some of the pedos that said they saw him in their cell said he would attack them. They'd start screaming and thrashing around, but when the CO showed up they were fighting with nothing. They were claiming it was nightmares until they noticed bite marks on the guys and scratches. Maybe they did it to themselves in their sleep, but I have never heard of anyone doing that to themselves. And anyways, some of those bites and scratches they'd have to be a damn contortionist to pull off. It got so bad they were starting to injure themselves bad enough to be sent to medical. One of them even managed to kill himself, maybe on accident, but who knows. Even the CEOs were refusing to go in that block after dark. Warden called a meeting and basically told us to lock that cell block and leave him to starve in there. Now for a straight-laced guy like that to tell us to basically murder a guy was unbelievable. And if you were to tell me that a month ago I'd have slapped you in the face on principle, but no one objected to the idea. We all knew that guy was bad for this place and the sooner he was dead the better. That was the plan until the bastard started talking. At first, some of COs swore they heard him repeat things they were saying, like he was listening to their conversations, and WOULD repeat a word here and there. Then one of them said they were walking past the cell block and they heard him repeating something over and over. They said it sounded like he was saying, "Please don't hurt me, and are you sure?" In this deep, wet voice, like a garbage disposal trying to unclog itself. When he went in to see if it was him talking, the guy clammed up and just stared at him, but he swears that creepy mother was grinning at him. Once he started talking, they had to call in the guy's attorney, which meant we had to make it look like we actually took care of the guy. After that, he was a regular chatterbox, saying all kinds of random things in broken English to anyone within earshot. Couple guys tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't answer questions or say anything that made any kind of sense. When his attorney showed up, he looked like he was about to go in for heart surgery. God help him. The law said we had to leave him alone in the room with the attorney. I didn't like the guy's odds. Most inmates wouldn't think of attacking their own attorney, the one person that's required to be on their side. But with this creep, you didn't know what he would do. They were in there for almost 3 hours before the attorney started screaming. Sounded like a little kid getting belted by his old man. I ran in there with a couple other guards and almost trampled the attorney, who was crawling away with one hand over his face and a trail of blood dripping from between his fingers. I turned on the creep, but he was just sitting in his chair at the table, so tall he looked like a grown-up sitting at a preschooler's desk. He was grinning like a skeleton. His lips looked gone, and his teeth were a blood orange color with flaps of skin stuck between them. Even with the adrenaline and in the heat of the moment, I couldn't bring myself to touch him. It was only when I saw 3 other guys surround him that I got the stones to grab him and pull him out of the room. The attorney lost his nose, said the guy shot across the table so fast he didn't have time to react. Bit his nose right off and swallowed it right in front of him. That was the only thing he said about it that made any sense. I heard he'd committed himself since then. Said he was screaming before the guy went for his nose because of the terrible things he was seeing and feeling. Guy had a total breakdown. Didn't even realize his nose was gone. When I went to warden to talk about it, he told me the attorney had left his notes and questions the guy had answered before everything went to hell. He couldn't look at them, legally, but he did anyway, and now he didn't know what to do with it. I managed to convince him to let me read it. If only he'd told me off and sent me home for even asking. God, what it said made sense and made no sense at the same time, if you can understand that. The questions the attorney asked were only half answered. Under the name question he only wrote empty, no name, and missing, whatever that means. Under the question about where he was from, the answer he wrote was under black, shadow fold, empty everywhere. The questions about if he understood what he was charged with and if he knew why he was arrested were both blank. The question about how he came to be here simply said, pain, hurt, bright, crushing, empty, trapped. The question about why he was here made the least sense. The answer he wrote was learning. Teach pain. Teach words. House school of suffer. Learn suffer. Learn live. Learn fun. The pages were stained with splotches of red, and I had to put them down before I lost my lunch. That was when I and the other CEOs had had enough. We took that bastard into solitary confinement, to the worst cell we had, and we laid into him. We beat the piss out of him. At first the guy was shouting and begging like any other inmate we put the boots to. For a minute I thought we won. Then he just stopped reacting completely. He was grinning, if you can call it that. The blood coming out of this guy was like the blood of a corpse, thick and dark and smelling worse than anything. One of the guys had to quit because he couldn't stop throwing up. Now the guy was laughing, chuckling in a low gurgling cough. We just wanted to break him, to put him in his place. But something inside me wanted to kill him in that moment. Something primal and unconscious. Not anger, but fear. Pure animal terror. That scared me enough to make me pull back. After that we went back to keeping him locked in the pedo block and tried to forget he was there while hoping he would starve to death soon. This worked until the prisoners started telling us they saw him out and creeping around after lights out. We ignored them at first, then it was getting to be every night. One or more would start screaming in their cell, saying he was in there with them, that he was in their dreams and was standing there when they woke up. None of the CEOs found him in any of the cells, of course, and the inmates were looking worse and worse. A fight in the lunchroom almost caused a riot. Everyone looked like POWs, pale faces, sunken crazy eyes. We had a lot of suicides piling up. That was when I noticed something strange. One night we forgot to cut the lights in the pedo block after dark. The lights were on all night. That night, we had no complaints from the inmates about the creep. I started leaving the lights on in the block at night, and with that the complaints disappeared. The creep, on the other hand, started making a terrible racket every night we left them on. So much so, the guards were getting fed up, and the inmates close enough to hear were starting to lose it. It all came to a head when the leaders of 3 of the biggest gangs in the prison approached the COs and gave them an ultimatum. They let them into the pedo block to take that weird bastard out once and for all, or they would tear this place apart until they could do it themselves. I wanted to shout out hallelujah and shake their hands, but we had to stay cool. I could see the relief in the other guys too. We set it up for them to go to his cell just after lights out. We had the system checked and the lights scheduled for a test to hide us moving them. Anything else could be attributed to camera malfunction due to the electrical issues. We sent them in there and waited at the front of the block. These guys were the scariest inmates we had, at least before the creep showed up. Sanchez was a short Mexican covered in tattoos and built like an MMA fighter. He was a hitman for MS-13, known for preferring to use a machete on his targets. Lincoln was almost as tall as the creep and wide as a Buick. He looked like an NFL linebacker with a steroid problem. Hoss was almost as big as Lincoln but looked more like a long-distance runner. He was white supremacist who liked to set black-owned churches on fire and wait outside with a Louisville slugger to bash in the heads of the fleeing congregants as they ran out. Just seeing them all together in the same room as you made you nervous. These guys were the apex predators of the LCF. When I heard the creep start screaming, I couldn't help but smile, and the other guards were laughing and patting each other on the back. That is until the screams started to sound like laughter. Our faces fell and we stared down the block at the cell, waiting for something to happen. That was when the lights went out and the laughter stopped. I shouted something about whoever shut the lights off to put them back on, but none of the others had touched the switch. It must have been the fish heads in maintenance shutting down random blocks for our cover story. I thought maybe it was fine until the screaming started. A scream so high and shrill it made the metal vibrate around us rang out of the darkness. Then a chorus of screams, sobs, and shouts poured out of that cell block like the gates of hell had opened. Someone shouted for the lights, but I only heard them faintly over the sounds coming from the dark. Christ, it was the worst thing I'd ever heard. Worse than the sounds of new guys being broken in on their first night on the block. I didn't know people could make those sounds, especially not those 3. Someone had to go in there, but no one stepped up. The noise brought other guards, and when the lights came back on, we formed a line and went in with our riot gear, ready for the worst. Or so we thought. God, the ugliness of that scene cannot possibly be described. The room looked like it had been freshly painted red. Sanchez was on his knees, digging organs out of his own torso like a farmer cleaning a pig for slaughter. His face was gone, and what was left of it was stuffed in his mouth like a sock. Lincoln was naked. His groin looked like an M80 went off in his pants, and he was slamming his bloody forehead into the cement wall so hard I could see brains starting to leak out of his ears. The only thing we found of Hoss was his scalp and 8 of his fingers. The creep was gone. We've been in lockdown ever since. It's been 5 days now and we haven't been able to leave. The inmates have been screaming for help and saying the creep has been picking them off one by one, driving them crazy. A lot of them have killed themselves. I'd feel bad if I didn't think it was keeping the creep from coming after us. I made sure the lights in here are all on all the time. I don't know if keeps him away. I don't know what the hell he is. Somehow he can move around the prison freely, past locked doors and walls. I think it has something to do with the dark, but I don't know. We've got our riot gear and some rifles. The warden is trying to organize us to sweep the prison and find the creep. If we can't find him or kill him, we'll have to call the cops in for backup. I hope we don't find him. I hope he's gone, and God help whatever town he shows up in.